We have learned a lot of information about Sublime Text events and event listeners so far in this video series. We've discovered how we could create an event listener and that we have events at our disposal for knowing when files are being loaded, saved, closed, modified, even when commands are being executed. We're in the home stretch now. There's only a couple of more events that we need to cover. Today, we're going to be focusing on one particular event, a very easy event to respond to, but a very powerful event indeed that ties directly into key bindings and your ability to tell Sublime in what situations they are relevant so that it knows if they should be applied or skipped over in favor of another one. And that event is on query context. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odat Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video course teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. Today's lesson is a continuation of our previous lessons on events and event listeners in Sublime Text plugins, and today we're focusing on the on-query context event. Now, this is a very powerful event. It ties directly into key bindings in Sublime Text and allows you to create your own key binding context, which you use inside of bindings to tell Sublime in what particular circumstances your key binding should be considered for actually being executed when the user presses a key. Now remember, when you use key binding context, you can basically assign the same key to multiple different key bindings, each one with a different set of contextual rules that says when that key binding itself should be considered active. And this allows you to overload, if you will, the same key with multiple different commands or the same command with multiple arguments that are suited for particular different situations, like being in a different file, being inside of a different part of a certain file, something along those lines. And what Sublime will do is check each of those key bindings in a hierarchical fashion until it finds one that applies, and then that is the binding that is executed. So this is a very powerful feature. Now, to be sure, you can sort of get this in many cases by using the isEnabled method of a command. All command classes support that particular method, and in the particular case of commands that are bound to keys, when Sublime has chosen a key binding and you press the key and the command is executed, the first thing Sublime will do is invoke its isEnabled method to ask the command, should you apply in this particular situation? And the command can say yes or no. If it says yes, then the command is executed. If it says no, everything stops. So this is a great way to make sure that a command doesn't execute when it's not supposed to. And in many cases, that is all you need. However, it's important to note that when this happens, when the isEnabled method is called, that's an indication that Sublime has chosen from amongst any possible key bindings bound to a particular key, which one it's going to use. So if the command decides it doesn't need to execute right now, it won't. But Sublime doesn't take that as an opportunity to go back to searching for other key bindings. So in the case where you want to use a key binding inside of your plugin or your own custom key bindings just for yourself as a user, and you want to overload, I like to use that term, a key that's, say, a default key, but you only want it to apply in a certain circumstance, you need to use a context for that. Now, Sublime comes with a large number of contexts built in, and you can compose those together in a lot of different ways, but sometimes you just need to have a little bit more functionality there. For example, you might want to execute a command only when its file name has a certain extension, or its file name starts with a certain bit of text or matches a particular pattern, maybe for a file that exists only in a particular type of or a particular location in the file, or as part of one particular project over another. Or you could even do complicated things like have your command only want to execute inside of files where you've already executed other commands from your plugin, perhaps doing some sort of setup so you can sequence commands in that particular fashion. So there's a lot of things that we can actually do with this particular event. And we have an example here, but before we get into actually doing something with this example, a couple of things to mention here. First, we're going to assume, based on what the terminology that we're using here, that you're familiar with key binding contexts, how you create one, and what they're actually for. And if you're not familiar with that, or you're just a little hazy because it's been a while since you used one, you need a little refresher, no worries. On the channel, there are videos that talk about key bindings generally and key binding context specifically, and I've linked them both down in the description below. So if any of this doesn't make any sense, you're not entirely sure what these terms mean, you can pause this, go watch that one, and then make sure you come back here and keep watching this particular video. Now, The other thing to mention here is that we're using, in this example, an event listener, but this event will also work in a view event listener as well. It behaves exactly the same way as this one does, except for view event listener differences, which is basically that the view argument wouldn't be provided to this event when it triggers, because view event listeners have the self.view property that specifies what view that particular instance of the listener applies to. So you could check it that way if you need that particular information. You don't need this parameter as we see it here. Now we have an example implementation of a context, but what exactly is this thing doing? Well, if we were to look at the default key bindings, there are a lot of context keys that are built into Sublime by default, and they are all documented, or most of them anyway, in the official documentation for key bindings, which should be linked down in the description below. And what we're looking at here are the sets of 4 bindings for handling auto pairing of quotes, automatically inserting the second one when you type the first one, deleting both of them if you backspace over one while the cursor is inside of one, wrapping the selection with one, and essentially skipping over the close one when you push the quote key while the cursor is already on it. It will skip over it instead of inserting another one, which would be irritating. These have a lot of context in them, which shows that with just composing commands that are already built into Sublime, or smaller, simple targeted plugin commands, you can get some pretty cool functionality just in the way that you're binding your keys. But our focus here is the setting context. This is one that's built into Sublime by default, and it allows you to specify any setting you like by providing it after the dot in the name. And here package dev is making that a little more clear by using its own custom syntax definition for key bindings. And that will allow you to test if settings are set to a particular value. Now, as defined in Sublime, the operator that you can use can only be equals or not equals, and the operand can only be true or false. That is, this allows you to take any setting you like and test its value, as long as it's a Boolean setting and you want to know if it's turned on or off. There are other settings that you might want to be able to test, settings that are set as strings or settings that are set as numbers. This context won't allow you to do that, but it is possible to create your own custom context that would allow something like that and a whole lot more. This is just a small, simple example. So if we come back now to this particular file here, this is showing our implementation. Now, the onQuery context event here gets, well, 5 arguments. View is the view that the cursor is currently inside, the currently focused view when the key was pressed. You can use that to determine whether or not your key context, whatever information you might need for the particular file, if there is one. And again, if you're using a view event listener, that wouldn't be provided. But the rest of these, key, operator, operand, match all, those are all the parts of the context object as they appear inside of the key binding itself. Remember also that key doesn't have a default value because it's what specifies what the context is actually supposed to be testing, some sort of condition that's being tested. But the operator has a default value, the operand has a default value, and match all, the value that says that if your context applies to selections, should it be applying to all of them, or is only one enough? All of those 3 have default values that Sublime applies behind the scenes. So regardless of what you see in the key binding itself, all 4 of those arguments will be provided to you with some sort of value. Now, the other thing to note here is that as Sublime is evaluating keys every time you press a key, because the context needs to be evaluated in the current context, so this isn't information that can be cached in any way. Whenever Sublime runs across a context with a key that it doesn't understand, it needs to go out and ask the plugins that are currently loaded if one of them understands the key, so that it can evaluate the context to determine if it actually applies right now or not. And this isn't a cooperative effort. Only one plugin can be implemented that specifies a key, or rather, if there's more than one, then the first one that says that it applies is the one that will be used. So Sublime does that by invoking the event one at a time through all of the listeners until one of them says that it does understand the context, and then Sublime can use that value to determine whether it applies or not. In order to specify that you don't understand the key, you need to return the value none from your handler. And this is very important because if you return true or false, as we'll see, that tells Sublime you understand the context and it either applies or it doesn't. So if you don't understand what the key is actually asking, then you should return none right away, stop all processing, and let Sublime move on to the next plugin in the chain to see if it knows about the particular key. Now here, the example that we're using is just like that settings context that we just looked at, but here we're going to allow any value to be compared to for any setting, not just Booleans, although we still are using only equals and not equals in this particular case. So the first thing we do here is check the key that is provided to see if it's something we understand. And much like the default one that we're replacing, the key always is going to start with view setting dot, and then what follows will be the actual name of the setting that we're testing. So if our key doesn't start with that string, we don't understand this, please go ask somebody else. We don't want to mess up some other key bindings by saying that we understand the context when we don't, because that is not going to go right. If we get past that line, then clearly we must know what this is, and we're going to need to do something with the value. Now, specifically, what we're going to want to do here is take the value of a setting to be able to compare it. So this code here is getting the name of the setting by throwing away the prefix on the key to come up with just the name that is in the end. That's just standard Python. That's nothing Sublime Text specific. And then we get the settings for this particular view to ask it for that, which is LHS, which is the left-hand side of whatever comparison we're about to do. Now, we haven't discussed settings in detail and how they work. We've only covered settings in the jargon or language of Sublime Text plugins lesson. We haven't discussed in any detail how settings actually work, but that is going to be the topic of an upcoming lesson. So if you haven't already done so, you might want to use those buttons down below, thumb, subscribe, share, ring the bell notification icon, keep abreast of all the lessons as they become active. But after those lines are done, then we have the value of the setting that the user says they want to test as part of their key binding. Now we actually have to do the rest of the work, and the two other parts of this are the operator and the operand. Remember, the operand is some value. In the settings context, it's true or false. If you were using the context that says how many selections there are, it would be a number, and you would put something like 1 or 3 or something along those lines in there. If you were using the regex operators to determine if the current line or the current selection contains particular text, then the value of the operand would be a string. And similarly, the operator says how you want to do with some sort of comparison on the operand that was provided. And while we are allowed to create our own keys at will, and the operand can be anything we like, the list of operators is constrained and isn't something that we can augment ourselves. Although there's nothing to stop us from taking any one of the ones that already exist and interpreting them in ways that their name doesn't necessarily represent. Just because these are named equal and not equal doesn't mean you couldn't reverse the sense of those inside of your context if you wanted to. Potentially not a good idea for readability's sake, but you do have that capability if you'd like to. Now, all of the operands, because there's a constrained list of them, are all defined as constants in the Sublime module, and there's a list of them that we can see here that represents all of the potential values that could be used inside of a key binding, which is equal, not equal, regex match, not regex match, regex contains, and not regex contains. And because we're the authors of what this context is actually trying to do, we are free to implement as many or as few of these as we need. The only important thing here is, because we haven't returned none yet, what we should return is true or false, which is an indication that we know what this key is and it either applies right now or it doesn't. If we say it doesn't apply, then Sublime will continue on to the next key binding to check its context. If we say it does apply, then Sublime will choose this key as the one to use, assuming all the other contexts also apply right now as well. So for our example here, simplistically, we're saying that if the operator is the equals operator, then our return value depends on whether or not the left-hand side of this, the actual setting represented, is equal to the operand provided. Or if the operator is not equal, do the reverse of that, only return true if they're not equal instead of if they're equal. And there are other operators here, but we don't necessarily care about any of those. So we're just going to assume in that case that the default answer is false. We don't apply. Someone used an operator we don't understand. Now, one thing that this particular example doesn't cover is the match all on the end. And remember when we talked about contexts in key bindings, it's possible for context to apply not just to a file as a whole, but to something specific to the selections in the buffer, like the text to the left of them, how many of them there are, the text to the right of them, things of that nature. If your context relies on something to do with the content of the buffer as it relates to selections, like text to the left, then you need to decide if your context should only apply when it's true for every selection in the buffer in case there's more than one, or if only one of them is valid. And then the value of match all tells you what the key binding thinks that should be. True would mean it must apply to every selection. False means only one. And what you would do in here depends on that particular case. We're not doing that here, but if that ever comes up for you, you can implement that if you like. So what we have here now is our own custom context named view setting that you can use inside of a key binding with a period and the name of a setting. You can use any setting you like, and you can compare if it's equal to or not equal to any value that you like, not just a Boolean like the one that's built in. So if we came to our sample key binding, I have two key bindings right here. They're both bound to the same key, and they're using the set setting command, which is a command that's built into Sublime that sets a view specific setting of the name provided to the value provided instead. And both of these bindings are on the same key, and they have very similar context. One of them only applies when the font size in the view is equal to 8, and the other one applies when the font size in the view is equal to 26. And the associated command just flip-flops the values. So this key will take the font size between 8 and 26 as long as it's one of those two things. And we saw another example of how to do something like this with one key binding and a custom plugin in another video on the channel that I've linked down below in case you find that interesting, way back in December of last year when we were talking about actually launching Plugin 101, the course you're watching right now. So the default font size that I use for these videos is 8. So when I press the key, Sublime's going to test the key bindings from the bottom up. The bottom one says, is the view font size 26? And the answer is no, so that binding is not used. That'll move it up one to test, is the font size 8? The answer to that is yes. So the font size command, or the set setting command, is used to set the font size in this buffer to 26. And when I press the key, I am now ready to project this up on the wall or have someone sitting behind my shoulder looking at my code based on the value I provided. Maybe they're 40 feet back getting coffee and they still want to see what's going on here. And we can very easily swap back the other way by using the same key because the other context has the opposite value of this. And this is just one example of a contrived example at that, but a good example of how you can create your own key bindings or your own context for your own key bindings rather to make them apply in very specific situations that are important to you that aren't otherwise possible. To recap what we learned in today's lesson, one of the powerful concepts of key bindings in Sublime Text is the ability to apply context, which allows you to have multiple bindings for the same key, but which apply in different situations. And Sublime can evaluate each one until it finds the one that applies to the current situation and implement that one. This provides you a lot of power. Now, to this end, Sublime has a large series of contexts built in, but sometimes those aren't enough, and you might need to implement your own for your own custom logic. And you can do that that by creating an event listener that responds to the on-query context event. The arguments to this particular event match the arguments that exist inside of a key binding context, and Sublime will invoke listeners one at a time for any key it doesn't understand until it finds the listener that says that it understands a particular key. And it's up to that listener and that particular event handler to evaluate the particular situation and say whether the binding exists or not. Using this inside of your own key bindings, you can overload default key bindings or other key bindings inside of your package and make sure that they apply only in the appropriate situation. So this is a very powerful concept. Now, there's only one other event left to talk about that we haven't covered yet so far in the series, and that's the on-query completions event, which allows you to inject completions into the auto completion system. And that is going to be the topic of the next lesson. So if you haven't already done so, you might want to use those buttons down below to thumb subscribe and share as you deem appropriate so that you know when that lesson and other lessons in this series and videos on the channel become available. And until any of those things happen, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.